Goedemiddag, dames en heren. Mag ik misschien toch even zien wie er hier Nederlands spreekt? Even de handjes omhoog. Okay. Yeah, well, I had looked forward to speaking finally in Dutch in my home country. But I think I'll have to proceed in English, so don't worry. I have a lot to cover, so let me get straight to the point. I want to focus my remarks on three topics. First, I will, oh yes, I have to change the slides. This is the title of my speech, Breaking the Boilerplate. That comes towards the end. I will first talk about the progress we are making towards the goal of global accounting standards. Then I will talk about some important parts of our current work program, which are loan loss provisioning, insurance, and the conceptual framework. And then finally, I want to, that will be the main topic of my speech, I want to talk about disclosures. Not so much how to get rid of them, but because that's what everybody likes. But I've developed a 10-point plan. That's what I like to do when I was in politics. It was always catchy, and I have 10 good proposals to make disclosures more effective. But first of all, global standards. How are we doing? How much progress are we making towards the goal of a single set of global standards? You may have seen that we have undertaken a major piece of research and are still doing so to find out exactly what the situation is around the world. And earlier this month, we published the first results on our website. And this survey encouraged some very encouraging insights into IFRS adoption. First of all, there is almost universal support for IFRS as the single set of global accounting standards. 95% of the jurisdictions have made a public commitment to the concept of a single set of high-quality global accounting standards. And what's more, almost every jurisdiction confirmed that this single set should be IFRS. And what was very interesting is when we asked that question to the SEC in the United States, they answered also, yes, we are in favor of a single set, and that single set should be IFRS. Secondly, more than 80% of the jurisdictions that we interviewed reported an IFRS adoption for all or almost all public companies. And most of the remaining non-adopters, such as, for example, Singapore, have made very significant progress towards IFRS adoption. And that is a very remarkable achievement when you consider that this shift has taken place in less than 10 years. And what is also very important, many people around the world say, well, oh yes, countries say that they adopt IFRS, but in reality they make a lot of exceptions. We have found out that there are in reality very few modifications made to IFRS. And what we've also seen, as you know, we have a very gruesome endorsement process in Europe, for example. In 40% of the countries that adopt IFRS, they do so automatically. They don't have any sort of endorsement process in place. Of course, those are our favorite jurisdictions. And where there are small modifications, such as a temporary deferral of IAS 41 in Malaysia, agriculture, they are very minor and they are seen as temporary as we assist in the migration from national GAAP to IFRS. And many of these temporary adjustments we are getting out of the way, such as IAS 41 agriculture. This week we proposed a proposal that very much meets the legitimate objections that lived around the world. Of course, it's true that a couple of very important countries still have not fully adopted IFRS, such as United States, Japan, India. But what is very important that even in such countries, a lot more progress is being made than most people realize. For example, Japan. Japan already permits the use of full IFRS for individual companies and has recently widened the scope of companies that are allowed to adopt. And the Japanese Business Association, Keidanren, expects that in the very near future, next 2 or 3 years, some 60 very large multinational Japanese companies will be using IFRS. And those 60 companies together represent 20% of the market capitalization of the Tokyo Stock Exchange. So that is quite significant. And contrary to what many think, the dynamics of IFRS adoption in Japan is still very strong. Also after the non-decision of the SEC. Everybody thought Japan was going to wait. It is not happening, fortunately. And then the United States. The SEC's 2007 decision to permit non-US companies to use IFRS to their American listers was a major game changer. And people also underestimate the importance of that decision. Today, more than 450 foreign private issuers are reporting using IFRS. And together they represent $5 trillion of market capitalization. So the use of IFRS in the United States is far from marginal. And by the way, in every American accountancy training program, CPA program, IFRS is now part of the program. So it is creeping into the United States. So all in all, I think we can conclude that amazing progress has been made around the world in terms of the use of IFRS. And that is also why this hall is for 2/3 filled with people from outside the Netherlands. Then the current work plan, just 3 major issues. Impairment. Well, as you know, this is a bit of a long and difficult, long and winding road that we are taking, but I think finally we are reaching the end. As you know, both the IASB and the FASB have developed proposals to replace the incurred loss model by an expected loss model. During the financial crisis, it has become clear that the incurred loss model had serious drawbacks. It simply gave too much room for banks to not recognize losses even when they were inevitable. Also, although the objective of the incurred loss model was to limit the room for big bath provisioning, there are strong indications of wide divergence in practice. Earlier this year, we published for public comment a simplified version of our expected loss model that we had jointly developed earlier with the FASB. And we believe that this model will lead to more timely recognition of credit losses than the existing incurred loss model. At the same time, you know that the FASB has taken a different road. They have developed another variant of expected losses, which is one that recognizes full lifetime expected losses on the day that you issue a loan. We don't think that is a good reflection of the actual economic situation, but they had their reasons to pursue this road. While we have currently divergence between the IASB and the FASB, and that is clearly very much undesirable, such an important part of our standards in this financial crisis. Not all is lost. We have overlapping comment periods. Our ends at the 5th of July, and in July the boards will sit together and look as constructively as possible if we can find a joint solution. Later this afternoon, the governor of the Dutch Central Bank, Mr. Klaas Knot, good friend of mine, He will speak here, and I'm sure he's going to talk about impairment as well, and he's going to lecture us very sternly that we should get our job done. And I will sit and listen humbly. Insurance. As you know, the insurance industry is hugely complex. It is also very important. It has a collective investment that runs into the trillions. And there can be no doubt about the systemic importance of the insurance industry. Actually, I'm a member as chair of the IASB of the Financial Stability Board, and they are going to identify globally systemically important insurance companies. Given this fact, it is simply unacceptable that we still do not have a proper standard for insurance contracts under IFRS. As a result, there is huge diversity and complexity in how insurance companies report their numbers around the world, and investors basically see the industry as a huge black box. Many insurance companies rely on outdated assumptions when measuring their liabilities. They can use interest rates from many years ago when interest rates were still high, while we know that the current low interest environment is very damaging to the insurance industry. In Japan, where low interest rates started much earlier, they caused tremendous havoc among insurance companies. Some of them went bankrupt, and others had to lower the returns, the guarantees that they had promised to their customers. Fortunately, the end to this unacceptable situation is in sight. Last week, we released our second and final exposure draft for a new insurance standard. And in our proposals, we require the measurement of the liability using current interest rates relevant to the liability. And that will allow investors to gain a much more realistic view on the true performance of the industry. Markets will gain much more insight into how effective insurers are in matching their liabilities with their assets. Our proposals will probably lead to a bit more volatility, but that is a reflection of real economic risks. And at the same time, we have worked very hard to ensure that the new standard minimizes non-economic accounting-related volatility. And our revised proposals go a long way to addressing concerns in this respect about our first exposure draft. We do have to acknowledge, though, that there has been a trade-off with increased complexity. We think that we got the balance between adjustments and increased complexity about right, but we are keen to hear views before moving on to finalize the standard during 2014. And then, last but not least, in terms of our current work program, the conceptual framework. We will very shortly, within a couple of weeks, for public comment, a discussion paper, which will set out our preliminary views on some fundamental accounting topics. I think the main ones are measurement and the meaning of other comprehensive income. We do not pretend that this discussion paper will give a definitive answer to all accounting problems. In the last 2 years, I have learned they do not exist. But even if we took 10 years and 1,000 pages, this could not be done. So we decided to discipline ourselves, both in terms of time and in scope. And thus far, we have been able to meet our deadlines, even though those deadlines were very ambitious and a lot of people told us, you're never going to make it. Despite these tight deadlines, I think we are able to produce a discussion paper that you will find both readable and thought-provoking. I trust it will serve as a solid basis for a very profound and lively public debate, and we are really looking forward to that. And hopefully we will be able to shed more light and also some more discipline on the most difficult issues that have confounded standard setters for many years. And we are really looking forward to engaging with you, and we are confident that we can make progress. Then finally, the main topic of my speech, disclosures. So we know that people complain a lot about disclosures. For many companies, the size of their annual report is ballooning. And the amount of useful information contained within those disclosures has not necessarily been increasing at the same rate. And the risk is that annual reports become simply compliance documents instead of instruments of communication, what they should be. In January this year, we got regulators, preparers, auditors, users, and standard setters. We got them all in the same room in London. We threw away the key, and we only let them out until when we had fully understood all the perspectives of this problem. And a common conclusion during that meeting was that many aspects of the disclosure problem have to do with behavioral factors. For example, many preparers will err on the side of caution and just decide to throw everything in the disclosures. They do not want to risk being asked by the regulator to restate their financials. And after all, no CFO has, to my knowledge, has ever been sacked for producing too voluminous disclosures. While if you have a restatement, that can be a very risky and career-limiting thing. Moreover, excessive disclosures, they can be very handy to hide information that is not all that pleasant. You have to give it put it somewhere in a disclosure where you think people will not notice it. And sometimes it is easier to just follow a checklist rather than put in the effort to make the information more helpful and understandable. So, in summary, understandable risk aversion on the part of preparers, auditors, and regulators leads to a ticking-the-box mentality. And the communicative value of financial instruments suffers as a result. So, what can we do to change this culture? What can we do to break the boilerplate? Well, first of all, we decided to give a good example ourselves. As you know, we are a complex multinational organization and of all of 120 people, and we had a rather voluminous annual report ourselves. And we managed to reduce the size of our 2012 annual report and the accompanying disclosures by 25% compared to last year. At the same time, we actually increased the amount of useful information in the report and made it much easier to read. I'll tell you, it took some very intensive discussions internally and also with our auditors. But I assure you, it can be done. More importantly, we recently published a feedback statement that set out the key messages of everything that we had heard during that meeting in London. And on the basis of this document, today I would like to set out a 10-point plan which I think can really deliver tangible improvements to disclosures in financial reporting. First of all, let me start with 8 possible measures that we think could lead to tangible results in the short run. And none of these points is particularly revolutionary, and some of them are very simple. However, I must tell you, in my experience in government, I always learned that the simplest solutions are usually the most effective in addressing very complicated problems. First of all, what we would like to do is to clarify in IAS 1 that the materiality principle does not only mean that material items should be included, but also that it can be better to exclude immaterial disclosures. Too much detail can make the material information more difficult to understand, so companies should proactively reduce the clutter. In other words, less is often more. Secondly, we should clarify that the materiality assessment applies to the whole of the financial statements, including the notes. Many think that items that do not make it to the face of the primary financial statements as a line item, that they need to be disclosed in the notes, just to be sure. We will have to make it clear that this is not the case. If an item is not material, it does not need to be disclosed anywhere at all in the financial statements, so also not in the notes. 3. We should clarify that if a standard is relevant to the financial statements of an entity, it does not automatically follow that every disclosure requirement in that standard will provide material information. Instead, each disclosure will have to be judged individually for materiality. 4. We will remove language from IAS 1 that has been interpreted as prescribing the order of the notes to the financial statements. And that should make it easier for entities to communicate their information in a more logical and holistic fashion, if they can make the order in the way that they like. 5th, we could make sure that IAS 1 gives companies flexibility about where they disclose accounting policies in the financial statements. Important accounting policies should be given greater prominence in financial statements, and less important accounting policies could be relegated to the back of the financial statements. 6th, at the request of many users around the world, we will consider adding a net debt reconciliation requirement. Not only would this provide users with clarity around what the company is calling net debt, but it also consolidates and links the clutter of scattered debt disclosures through the financial statements. 7. We will look into the creation of either general application guidance or educational material on materiality. Doing so should provide auditors, preparers, and regulators with a much clearer, more uniform view of what it is that constitutes material information. And we plan to be working with the IASB and IOSCO, the World Federation of Securities Regulators, on this very important matter. And then 8th, when developing new standards, we will also seek to use less prescriptive wordings for disclosure requirements. Instead, we will focus on disclosure objectives and examples of disclosures that meet this objective. In recent standards, we have already started doing so, creating more explicit room for judgment on disclosures and materiality. Finally, we will begin work on 2 pieces of work which will deliver improvements not in the short run but more in the medium term. First of all, during the second half of 2013, we will begin a research project to undertake a more fundamental review of IAS 1, IAS 7 and IAS 8. And this project will revisit some of the work we already did for the financial statement presentation project, which was halted. The goal will be to replace those standards, in essence, creating a new disclosure framework. And then finally, once the review of these standards has been completed, we will then undertake a general review of disclosure requirements in existing standards. So if you guys were thinking that we were entering a period of calm, I think we will keep pretty busy. I am actually convinced that these measures have great potential. And even the 8 quick wins, modest as they are in themselves, I think they can have a very big impact. Because if you take them together, they remove most excuses for boilerplate disclosures. And they will certainly help to ignite the much-needed change in mindset of preparers, auditors, and regulators, and change of mindset that is truly sorely needed. The IASB will continue to engage with these constituents and also, very importantly, of course, with users for the joint effort that is needed to make disclosures less discriminate, less indiscriminate, and more meaningful. Ladies and gentlemen, I am grateful for your attention. We have covered a great deal of ground during my opening remarks. I have talked about how the IFRS profiles provide strong evidence of the successes of IFRS around the world. I've talked about some major projects that we are working on, and I have set out a 10-point plan to improve financial disclosures. I think we have a really good, interesting, wonderful program for you in these 2 days, and I look forward to what will hopefully be a very thought-provoking day. I thank you very much for your attention.